So Sam, the purpose of this interview is to estimate your lifetime noise exposure. What that means is we're going to get you to identify activities that have caused you to be in noisy situations, then estimate how long you spent in those situations and how noisy they were. What I mean by a noisy situation is the kind of place where if you and I were 4 feet apart, as we are now, you would have to raise your voice to communicate with me. And assume in that scenario that I have normal hearing, that I'm not wearing any ear protection, and that we're able to see each other's faces and gestures clearly. So situations that are at least that noisy are the ones we're interested in. Anywhere that's a bit quieter and doesn't cause you to raise your voice, you can ignore. Finally, there's one other kind of noisy activity that we'll look at, and that is listening to earphones or headphones with the volume set quite high, above about 70% of maximum volume. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine.
So now what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes to note noisy activities that have been part of your life. Listed here are some common noisy activities that might help to jog your memory, but don't restrict yourself to items on this list. Also note any other noisy activities that you've experienced. And don't note activities just because they're on this list. So if you've experienced one of these activities but you didn't find it noisy, ignore it. Finally, don't worry about making your notes neat and tidy. They're just for you to jog your memory later in the interview, and you can add to them at any time. Okay? So now we'll look at one exposure activity in detail. Which activity do you think has contributed most to your overall noise exposure?
I would say probably going to gigs.
Okay, going to gigs. So now we need to estimate how long you spent at gigs. And as a first step, I'll ask you to identify a period of your life where your habits were fairly stable. So a number of years where there weren't major changes in how often you went to gigs or how loud or how long they were. And it might be that you find you need to break your life into a few different periods. So maybe you went to a lot of gigs from 16 to 21 and then fewer from 21 to 29. In that case, we'd look at each period separately. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So which period of your life should we look at first?
I would say my university years, so ages 18 to 22. But I also went a little bit before university, maybe 16 to 18. And then I went again a little bit less often from ages 22 to now to present.
Okay, so we'll look at 18 to 22, and then later on we'll look at 16 to 18 and 22 to present. So now we'll estimate how often you went to gigs during those years. First of all, during those years, 18 to 22, did you tend to go to gigs all year round or only parts of the year?
It was mainly during term time, so it's around about 9 months of the year.
And during term time, how often did you tend to go?
It varied a little bit, but maybe twice a week.
Okay, and when you were at the gigs, how long did the music tend to last for?
Well, I like to get there for the support acts as well, so it was probably around about 2.5 hours in total.
Okay. So that is 4 years, about 36 weeks a year, 9 months a year, you said, 2 days a week, and about 2.5 hours for each session. Now we're going to estimate how noisy it was. So again, if you imagine that you and I are at the typical gig from that period, and that we're trying to communicate from 4 feet apart, just as I described earlier, which of the following things would you need to do to communicate with me? Would you need to raise your voice, or talk loudly, or talk very loudly, or shout, or move closer and shout from 2 feet away, or shout in my ear?
Well, I suppose it varied from gig to gig depending on where you were stood in the crowd, but on average, probably shout from 4 feet.
Okay, shout from 4 feet. So when you were going to gigs during that time, did you ever wear hearing protection of any kind?
Yeah, I sometimes wore earplugs.
Sometimes. Okay, so not all of the time. Could you estimate what proportion of time you wore them?
Approximately 50%.
Okay. And can you remember approximately what kinds they were? So there's a few examples on here that might help to jog your memory.
I can't remember the exact type. They were kind of orange foam, squishy ones, looked a little bit like bullets. I'd say they looked most like these ones, the formable earplugs.
Okay, that's useful. So we're going to note down 50% of the time they were worn, and they're soft foam. So we've looked at ages 18 to 22. You said you did a bit of gig going before and after that. Which period of your life do we look at next?
I would say from graduating to the present now.
Okay, so that's 22 to 29. So let's look at how long you were exposed during that period. So we've looked at going to gigs across your full lifetime. Now we'll move on to the next noisy activity. So what do you think's been another big contributor to your noise exposure?
When I was younger, I used to listen to a lot of music on earphones via my iPod or on my phone.
Okay, so iPod or phone with earphones. Remember, we're interested in loud earphone use with the volume set at or above 70% of maximum volume. Can you think of a number of years of your life where you listened that loud and when your listening habits were fairly stable?
So I'd say the last couple of years of school and university years, mainly on my commute to and from.
So that would be 16 to 22.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now let's look and see how long you were exposed overall during that period. And how loud did you tend to have the volume on average? So was it maximum volume, 90%, 80%, 70%?
Well, it was mainly listening on buses, so it's pretty loud, so I have to turn up the volume quite loud. I would probably say about 90% of maximum on average.
Okay, so that is 90% of maximum volume. So now let's see if there was any other listening through earphones during other periods of your life. So we finished looking at your recreational noise exposure. Now we're moving on to occupational and educational noise exposure. So have you ever had a job or a course of study that caused you to be in a noisy situation?
Yeah, I worked in a bar.
Okay, bar work. And which period of your life should we look at for that? Finally, we'll move on to firearm noise exposure. So have you ever fired a gun of any kind?
Yeah, twice.
And were you wearing hearing protection?
One time, yes, we were at a shooting range and you're required to use ear defenders, over-ear defenders. And the second time, no, that was shooting a shotgun, but it was only a few times.
So the rounds that you fired with hearing protection we won't worry about. So we'll just focus on the shotgun use. How many rounds was it approximately?
It was about 5.
Okay, so that's shotgun use and about 5 rounds in total. Sometimes what seems to be an activity is actually a cluster of related activities with very different sound levels, exposure patterns, or use of hearing protection. Concerts might include folk concerts and heavy metal concerts. Playing in a band might include noisy performances and quieter practice sessions. If the respondent's memory allows them to report these activities separately, then ask them to do so. So one of your noisy activities is playing in a band. Do we need to break that down into more specific activities like practicing with your band versus performing, or was it all pretty much the same in terms of how noisy it was and how long you played and your use of hearing protection? Some noisy jobs are only noisy some of the time. For example, bar work might include a few noisy hours serving customers and quieter hours cleaning up. Ask the respondent if different parts of their job involve different sound levels or use of hearing protection. Record them as separate activities and ignore the ones that weren't noisy. The NESI records frequency of exposure in weeks per year and days per week. Sometimes respondents will report frequency in another way, for example as days per month or days per year. Go ahead and let them do so, and then you convert the information into weeks and days. For example, twice a month for 3 years means 3 years, 24 weeks per year, and 1 day per week. And if you find this conversion difficult to do, you can leave it until after the interview. The NESI includes a tool for estimating the sound level from earphones and headphones if they're being used with personal listening devices, which means smartphones, tablets, and personal music players. But sometimes people use earphones and headphones with other equipment like PCs, stereos, or recording equipment. In these cases, you'll have to use some other method to estimate sound level. Our recommendation is that you leave this kind of listening activity until the end of the interview and then estimate sound level by comparison with other activities that the respondent has already reported. So earlier you described listening to earphones attached to your iPod or phone when you were about 16 to 22 with the volume set quite loud. Now we're talking about listening through headphones attached to your PC in the last few years. Would you say that the volume that you use now is louder than or quieter than or about the same as when you were listening in those earlier years? Different individuals have very different noise exposure histories, so some interviews will take longer than others. But you might be working to a tight schedule. If it seems that the respondent has a complex history, you can ask them to reduce the precision of their reporting as they get towards the end of each exposure category. For example, maybe you've dealt with recreational exposures to concerts, nightclubs and motorbikes, and now you're looking at jet ski use. So, rather than looking at 3 life periods with slightly different exposure habits, you can instead ask them to describe their average exposure habits for one long period. This shouldn't do too much harm to the overall accuracy of the NESI because by this point you should have already dealt with the activities that contributed most to overall noise exposure. And remember, the really important thing is to make sure that the interview doesn't get cut off and that you report information for all the exposure activities across the entire lifespan.